I can understand why the notion of God has arisen and persisted, for it provides a simple, purported explanation of great matters. It is a comfort blanket for the anxious and deprived, and it is a powerful weapon of control. You have a choice to accept, on faith alone, that there is a God, and lie back, luxuriating in the foam of satisfaction. There is no longer any need to think. For why pursue the incomprehensible any further than comforting assertion? Or you can take delight in the power of the collective human intellect, an intellect that burrows into experiences, is currently in hot pursuit of comprehension on this side of the grave, and adds to life the delight of true understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Atkins. And now, Professor Craig, your first opportunity for a rebuttal.
You'll recall that in my opening speech, I said that I would defend two basic contentions tonight. First, that there are good reasons to think that theism is true, and secondly, that there are not comparably good reasons to think that atheism is true. Now let's turn to that second contention, that there are not comparably good reasons to think that atheism is true. In his opening speech, Dr. Atkins more or less admitted this. He said that I cannot prove that God does not exist. I can only show that God is not necessary. Well, now notice that merely leaves you with agnosticism. That is to say, the position that you don't know whether or not God exists. And that's not incompatible with the existence of God or even Christian theism. Indeed, many Christian theologians hold the position that there aren't good arguments for God's existence. I disagree with them, but nevertheless, that's consistent with a Christian position. So at most, we're left with agnosticism. Secondly, Dr. Atkins also says that he rejects any sort of God of the gaps approach. There's nothing in the universe that cannot be scientifically explained. Now, he admits that's merely a promissory note. He takes that by faith. But nevertheless, I want to make it very clear that I'm not postulating a sort of God of the gaps this evening to plug up holes in scientific knowledge. Rather, my claim is that science can provide evidence for a premise in an argument leading to the conclusion that God exists. For example, in my cosmological argument, there's scientific evidence for that key premise that the universe began to exist. So science does help, I think, to establish theism, not directly but indirectly by supplying evidence for a premise in a philosophical argument leading to a theological conclusion. And so I want to insist as clearly as I can that this is not a debate between science and religion tonight. On the contrary, I think that science provides good evidence for premises in arguments that have theologically significant conclusions. Finally, he does allude very briefly to the problem of evil, saying that this makes it unlikely that God exists. Now, what Dr. Atkins seems to be saying here, although he didn't flesh out this argument, is there's some kind of an inconsistency between the statement God exists and evil exists. But the problem is those two statements are not logically contradictory with each other. And therefore, the atheist must be assuming some implicit premises, some hidden assumptions that would bring out that contradiction and make it explicit. The problem is no atheist has ever been able to identify what those hidden premises are. And if Dr. Atkins knows what they are, then I will ask him to please share them with us and to show us that those premises are necessarily true, because unless and until he does that, he hasn't shown any incompatibility between God and the evil in the world. Indeed, I would say that we can actually go one step further. We can actually show that God and the evil in the world are consistent. To do that, all you need to do is find a third statement that is composable or consistent with God's existence that entails that evil exists. Here's such a statement. God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world. As long as that is even possibly true, it shows that God and evil are logically consistent with each other. So Dr. Atkins would have to show us that it is impossible that God could have morally sufficient reasons for allowing the evil in the world. And in so doing, he will have taken on a burden of proof that is simply unsustainable by the atheist. The prominent metaphysician Peter Van Inwagen says, "It used to be held that evil was incompatible with the existence of God, that no possible world contained both God and evil. So far as I am able to tell, this thesis is no longer defended, not even by atheists." So we've not heard any good arguments for atheism this evening. What about my arguments on behalf of theism? First, I argued that the origin of the universe points to the existence of God. I argued first that the universe began to exist, and I presented both philosophical arguments and scientific evidence in support of that premise, and Dr. Atkins doesn't deny it. Then I said, if the universe did begin to exist, then there was a transcendent cause of the universe which brought it into being. And here Dr. Atkins says, well, science can't explain how nothingness can turn into something, but he hopes that eventually it will. Now, it needs to be understood, first of all, that Professor Atkins is asking the wrong question. The question is not how nothing can turn itself into something. That is to treat nothingness as though it were something. But nothingness isn't anything. It has no properties, no powers, no potentialities. It can't turn itself into anything. The question, rather, is why did the universe come into being? Why did the universe begin to exist? We're looking for a cause of the universe. And what Professor Atkins says in his book on being is that, in fact, the universe never really began to exist because nothing exists. He says the positive and negative energy in the universe balance each other out, and thus on balance there is zero energy, and therefore really nothing exists. Not you, not me, not Professor Atkins, not the universe. Nothing exists, and therefore there's nothing to explain. Now I want to say, first of all, this is a really bad argument. Just because there's positive and negative energy in the universe doesn't mean that therefore there's nothing. That would be like saying that if I've got 10 pounds in my wallet and I owe you 10 pounds, then in fact I've got nothing in my wallet, which is absurd. Just because on balance I have no financial statement of a positive nature doesn't mean I don't have any money or that money doesn't exist. And thus Christopher Isham, who is a quantum cosmologist at Imperial College, points out there still needs to be ontic seeding, as he puts it, to create the positive and negative energy in the first place. So this is a bad argument for nothing's existing. Secondly, I want to say, in any case, the conclusion is absurd. First of all, it's self-contradictory. If you say there is positive energy and there is negative energy, the is an existential is in those statements. You're saying there exists positive energy and there exists negative energy, and that contradicts the statement that nothing exists. So the position on its face is patently self-contradictory. Moreover, it is absurd to say that nothing exists. I at least exist. And I know that I exist. It's undeniable that you at least exist. I'm reminded of the story of a philosophy student, a fresher, who came bursting into his philosophy professor's office early one morning, unshaven, bleary-eyed. He'd obviously been up all night. He'd been reading Descartes, who doubted his own existence. And the student said to the professor, "Professor, I've got to know, do I exist?" And the professor looked at him and said, "Who wants to know?" At least your own existence is undeniable. And in any case, if Professor Atkins is right, then nobody has really offered this objection, right? Because nobody exists. So why should I bother refuting it if the objection doesn't even exist and nobody has ever raised it? So I think the conclusion is clearly absurd. I gave 3 reasons as to why something can't come into being out of nothing. First of all, as Professor Atkins recognized, nothingness has no properties, no powers, no potentiality. It's just non-being. It has no ability to produce anything. Second, if something could come from nothing, then just anything and everything could come into being from nothing. And it's inexplicable why it's just universes. Why not root beer and Beethoven and bicycles? Nothingness, there's nothing about nothingness that could make it discriminatory, because nothingness has no power. It's not anything. And then finally, as I say, to suggest that things come into being out of nothing would completely undermine the whole project of modern science. The most important principle underlying modern science is that out of nothing, nothing comes, and therefore we seek explanations. So his view is deeply unscientific, I think. So it follows from those premises that therefore the universe has a cause, and then I deduced philosophically some of the conclusions, or rather some of the attributes of that cause. Notice I didn't in any time postulate God to fill a gap in scientific knowledge. This is a philosophical argument offered by a metaphysician for a philosophical conclusion. Secondly, I argued that objective moral values and duties in the world point to God, and Professor Atkins hasn't yet responded specifically to that, and we'll wait to hear his response. Thirdly, on the resurrection of Jesus, all Dr. Atkins had to say is there's absolutely no evidence of miracles. Well, I beg to differ. In the case of the resurrection of Jesus, you've got the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the Christian faith itself, and these are agreed upon by the majority of New Testament historians who have written on this subject. N.T. Wright, a very prominent British scholar in this area, says, and I quote, "The empty tomb and appearances have a historical probability so high as to be virtually certain, like the death of Augustus Caesar in AD 14 or the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So these facts are firmly established and agreed upon. The only question is, how do you best explain them? Well, here Dr. Atkins says maybe it was a cover-up. This is to recur to the old conspiracy theory of English deism that was offered back in the 17th century, and which no contemporary scholar would defend today. To mention just a couple of problems with it, it's hugely implausible. It doesn't take seriously what a disaster the crucifixion was for the disciples. There was no expectation in Judaism of a Messiah who, instead of establishing David's throne in Jerusalem, would be defeated and humiliated by the Gentiles and killed by them. So if your favorite Messiah got himself crucified, you basically had 2 choices. You either went home or you got yourself a new Messiah. But in no other case did anyone say that he's risen from the dead. Secondly, it's completely anachronistic because it associates the idea of resurrection from the dead with the Messiah. And in Judaism, those are completely separate ideas. Resurrection occurs only after the end of the world. And for that reason, and many others, the theft hypothesis and conspiracy is rejected by contemporary scholars. No one defends it. So I think we've got good reasons for theism, not comparably good reasons for atheism, and therefore I think theism is the more rational position.